we go.
There we go. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so welcome to CLS. Our speaker today is Roger Pielke. He's a professor of political science at the University of Colorado Boulder. His expertise lies, in his own words, at that messy intersection of science, policy, and politics. He has published vastly in many disciplinary fields. His latest book is titled The Rightful Place of Science, Disasters, and Climate Change. He's the author of the popular Substack, The Honest Broker, in which he discusses the complexities of science, policy, and policy interactions. Today, he's here to talk about climate wars. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Great to see everyone. I've got a million slides. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to tell a bit of a story. I've been doing this climate stuff for a long time. And I'm going to get some science in there too as we go through. If you have questions along the way, you're welcome to put them in the chat. I got the window open. So, based on the pandemic teaching, I think I can monitor the chat at the same time I do the slides. So with that, I'm going to jump right into it. All right, so I'm going to talk about a lot of things other than climate policy. But before I jump in, for a long time, 30 years, I've argued that climate change is real, it's serious, and it's deserving of our attention to mitigation and adaptation. That reality and the importance of the policy issues does not mean that we can abandon scientific integrity. And a lot of what I've seen over my career, and lucky me in the areas where I work in, is that scientific integrity gets abandoned pretty quickly on this issue. And I'll talk about some of those issues. All right, this is me. 30 years ago, I was a postdoc at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, brought in by a guy named Mickey Glantz, who's still kicking around Boulder, to study extreme weather events. This was really before climate became associated with extreme weather events to the degree it has been. My focus was on hurricanes and floods, on the role of forecasts in trying to ameliorate societal impacts. And that got me launched on really 30 years of studying extreme events around the world. Another moment in time, I think colleague texted me. I don't think he called me, but in October 2016 and said, you're in the WikiLeaks today. And I thought, yeah, that's funny, haha. But I was in the WikiLeaks. In the future, or maybe even today, I'm the answer to a trivia question. Who's the only person who appeared in the ClimateGate emails and the WikiLeaks release? That would be me, and in both cases, revealing efforts to suppress my research, which was interesting. So I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened. This was my academic office for 2 years. My department moved some boxes that weren't mine and some empty file cabinets into it, making it inaccessible. So I worked off campus for a couple years. I complained mightily, and then last year, I was given a new office in the stadium. I was removed from my department, have no departmental affiliation, which is one reason I'm leaving the university. And then 3 days before Christmas, I learned they're putting a new video board up in the stadium, and I'd have access to my office again in September 2024. So it's been an interesting journey, and I'll be happy to talk more about university life and so on. But at this point, I am announced that I'm retiring from the University of Colorado at the end of the year, aiming to be the youngest emeritus professor in America. I think we'll be close. Happy to talk about that also. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, in my presentation, how did I get from winning awards for my research to not having an office or a department on my own campus. So I'm going to start my story in 2013. At the time, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, had just released its so-called SREX report, Special Report on Extreme Events. I was not involved with it, but overall they did a very good job. And I was summarizing that report in congressional testimony. And to my surprise, my testimony went viral. Within a couple weeks, it got 400,000 views on YouTube. Which is not normal for congressional testimony. And that brought a lot of attention to the summary, and I faithfully summarized, and I'll go through some of that science with you all today. In February, John Holdren, President Obama's science advisor, was testifying before the exact same committee. And he gave testimony that was at odds with what I had said and also at odds with what the IPCC had said. And a smart senator or smart staffer had noted that Holdren was offsides with respect to the science and called him out on it in that hearing. And Holdren was a little chagrined. He mentioned me by name, said, well, you can't listen to Roger Pielke. He's out of the mainstream. But Holdren was angry enough that he went back to the White House. He was the director of OSTP. Here he is testifying. He went back to the White House and he wrote 6 pages about me. You can't read that, but it says drought and climate change, an analysis of comments by Roger Pielke Jr. It read a little bit like something that your crazy uncle would have posted on Facebook. It was just a kind of a screed. I didn't say anything about drought. I had a summary of what the IPCC said and a chart from the U.S. National Climate Assessment. That was it. And John Holdren manufactured 6 pages. What I did realize, though, is that the White House really is a bully pulpit. I think I'm the only academic or scientist in the era of the internet that has been singled out by the White House for an attack like this. And it wasn't much longer that, based on Holdren's complaints, I was being investigated. This is Representative Raul Grijalva, who accused me and several others of taking money under the table, perhaps from Exxon, in exchange for my congressional testimony that the nation's leading scientist, John Holdren, found to be wrong. So I was written up in the New York Times with accusations of funding irregularities. Probably more impactful was the local coverage. So CU Boulder's Roger Pielke Jr. targeted by congressmen over research funding, with the idea that yeah, I probably was guilty. You can I don't know if you can see it, but Roger Pielke Jr., who claims he's a climate change skeptic. So by denying that I was a skeptic, I guess that also made me a denier. But my wife heard about this at her work. My kids asked me if I was going to be fired from my job. No one at my university spoke to me about this. I received emails from lawyers. And really, this is the moment in time when administrators at my university basically abandoned me, turned on me, and that led to where I'm at today. They went through with the investigation, and my Ferrari, it's just out in the driveway. It does say Exxon on the license plate, but no. I was investigated, and no, there's no secret money coming under the table from anyone. So that was the context. All right, so while this was going on, I had been hired by Nate Silver to write for 538. Nate had interviewed me for his book, Signal and the Noise, and we knew each other a bit. And I said, well, this climate stuff is getting a little crazy. If you let me write about sports, I'll write about science and science policy and even climate for you. So here's Nate when he was popular badass in the war room. And if you look over his left shoulder up there, it says climate change. That was the first piece he asked me to write. It was basically summarizing my congressional testimony and the IPCC SREX report, which I did, and they had great editors, and it turned out really well, and it's still really great. But oh my goodness, the world went absolutely crazy. This is what the SREX says. Long-term trends in economic disaster losses adjusted for wealth and population increases have not been attributed to climate change, but a role for climate change has not been excluded. That remains current. That was accurate science then. It's accurate science now. Some people don't like it, obviously. So here's my piece. Disasters cost more than ever, but not because of climate change. Basically, translating into English, the IPCC. The world went crazy. Paul Krugman called for me to be fired. All these journalists at different outlets sought to have me removed. There was an online campaign. Nate Silver bent under the pressure, unfortunately. There was a Twitter campaign with bots. And so lost my job. WikiLeaks later revealed that there was a campaign funded by Tom Steyer, led by John Podesta, to have me fired. The most offensive thing about all this, if you can see that little screenshot I took, thanks to our efforts, climate confusionist Roger Pielke Jr. has stepped down from his role at 538. Help us win more victories for climate truth by pitching in $10 today. I mean, $10. I mean, getting me fired has got to be worth, at least 20, maybe 25. I don't know. So the WikiLeaks came out, and things really kind of changed at that point. This is 2016, so this is after all that had kind of receded. And the WikiLeaks revealed, and this is a quote from the WikiLeaks, I think it's fair to say that without climate progress, that was Joe Rahm's blog at the Center for American Progress, Pielke would still be writing on climate change for 538. So that's Tom Steyer, John Podesta, Judd Legume talking, about how they had organized this effort. Then I appeared in the local Boulder media again. They had found a better picture of me, and certainly a different tenor. WikiLeaks exposes liberal groups' efforts to thwart climate writings of CU's Roger Pielke Jr. To their credit, the Board of Regents at the University of Colorado had a statement in support of academic freedom. It was 9-0. This was a time when there was no 9-0 votes in the Colorado Regents. So it was good to have support from the very, very top. But again, no one on my campus, not a department chair, no one mentioned any of this to me. In fact, this time I was pretty much abandoned by my university. I did write a book about the science underlining these issues, which I updated in 2018, probably due for a new update. But what I'd like to do is talk about some of the science that's behind this. And really the idea of this book was motivated by President Obama's radio address in June 2013. This was almost the same week as my initial Senate testimony that went viral. And I voted for President Obama twice. I probably would have voted for him a third time if it was constitutionally allowed. But he was wrong on this issue. And I'm very firm in the belief that even if you vote for someone, if they say false information in your area of expertise, you have an obligation to speak out. And so what President Obama said that was wrong. He's talking about climate change. We know no single weather event is caused by climate change. All weather events are affected by it. More extreme droughts, floods, wildfires, and hurricanes. You maybe plausibly can link that to wildfires, but the others are wrong. And then in my wheelhouse, he says Americans across the country are already paying the price of inaction. And as I'll show, that's just not correct. And of course, politicians like to play politics with the weather, and it's not Democrats, it's not Republicans, it's everyone. My expertise happens to be in extreme weather events. All right, so I'm not going to go through all phenomena. This won't be a semester-long lecture, but I'll go through hurricanes in some detail and then summarize some of the other phenomena. And let me say, these slides have a lot of information, and I'm happy to make them available to anyone. Just email me after. So let's talk about hurricanes. This is a graph that comes from NOAA. It's also from a paper of ours led by Phil Klotzbach, which I've continued to update. This is all continental U.S. landfalling hurricanes for 124 years. And there's a lot of ups and downs, but there's no secular increase over this period of record. Interestingly, this graph has never appeared in an IPCC report. It's never appeared in the U.S. National Climate Assessment, and you will not find it in the Washington Post, New York Times, or any other major media. It's pretty simple. The numbers only go up to 7, and it's a bar graph, but it's not shown. Here is Bill Nye, I guess about a year and a half ago, showing up on CNN with my graph. And he used a Sharpie and he scratched out no increase in hurricane frequency. That wasn't my title, somebody else's, and put increase. Okay, yep, he's not a statistician. Yeah, there's my graph. So I guess I can say my graph has appeared in the major media. It has been on CNN at least. Of note, U.S. major landfalling hurricanes. These are category 3 and above. These are the most significant hurricanes. These are the ones that cause about 85% of total damage in the U.S. These are the ones that really matter from the standpoint of economic impacts in the insurance industry. If you take a look at that graph, you see a big gap, 2005 to 2017. That gap is when no major hurricanes struck the United States. It's the most notable feature of this time series. And I explain this to reporters. I say, if you became climate aware after 2005, then yes, you're going to think there's been an increase in major hurricanes. And there has, starting in 2006 to today. Oh my gosh, it's a remarkable increase. But over the long term, that fit is about as flat as you're going to get. Nothing I say on hurricanes is out of the scientific mainstream. This is NOAA from just 3 weeks ago. It is premature to conclude with high confidence that human-caused increases in greenhouse gases have caused a change in past Atlantic Basin hurricane activity that is outside the range of natural variability. It's a lot of words, a lot of technical jargon there, but the point there is if there is a signal of human-caused climate change in the behavior of hurricanes, it hasn't been detected yet. This is from Ryan Maui. This is a time series of 12-month sums. At the top is all hurricanes. At the bottom is major hurricanes. This is global. And again, a lot of ups and downs, but there's no secular increase in that time series. And again, here's what the IPCC says. Less and less is the IPCC cited these days because it has statements like this. No trend in the frequency of USA landfall events. I showed you those. There's still no consensus on the relative magnitude of human and natural influences on past changes in Atlantic hurricane activity. Globally, there's low confidence in most reported long-term, multi-decadal to centennial trends in tropical cyclone frequency or intensity-based metrics. Again, climate change is real, but we haven't seen its signal show up in tropical cyclones around the world or those that affect the United States. So is it possible or likely that climate change may result in more hurricanes or more intense hurricanes, cause a significant increase in hurricane rainfall, change landfall locations, change how fast hurricanes intensify, and more questions. And of course, these are possibilities, but these are hypotheses, not conclusions. And a lot of our public discussions, at least, is very quick to translate hypotheses into firm conclusions. All right, let me talk about global disasters. A disaster occurs when an extreme event encounters an exposed and vulnerable society. If you want to look for trends in climate phenomena, look at climate data. Don't look at disaster data or economic data. So this is from, this is a unfortunate statement. This is from the World Meteorological Organization, which is a scientific organization. The number of weather, climate, and water-related disasters has increased by a factor of 5 over the past 50 years. Antonio Guterres, floods, droughts, heat waves, extreme storms, and wildfires are going from bad to worse, breaking records with alarming frequency. So let's take a look at the data. These data come from a group called MDAT, which is at the Center for Research in the Epidemiology of Disasters in Belgium. And they have been very consistent over many decades explaining that this increase that they show in the number of disasters is really the result of better reporting. In fact, in the 1980s, there were no disasters in Africa. Believe it or not, incredibly, there's no reported disasters in Africa. Telecommunications, media, increased international cooperation has played a critical role in the number of disasters reported at the international level. In fact, what they say is that their data is pretty robust from the turn of the century. And if you look from the turn of the century to today, there's no increase in the reported number of disasters. This is Debarati Guha-Sapir, who was responsible for maintaining and collecting this data set for many decades. And she, in an interview in 2021, she expressed frustration. We said at our press conference that there's not been an increase. Nobody wants the good news. Yeah, I have data on weather costs relative to GDP, and I'll show that in a few moments. Yeah, I'm not going to show loss of life from disasters. That's gone down 1, 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude in 100 years. All right, let's talk about U.S. disasters. So we have this dynamic in the United States. NOAA keeps a time series of what's called billion-dollar disasters. I just had a paper accepted in a Nature journal critiquing the billion-dollar disaster data set under NOAA's scientific integrity policies. It's a problem. It's a big issue. My paper is going to be coming out. I'm supposed to get the page proofs any day now. There have been several scientific integrity complaints filed with NOAA about this data set. What happens is NOAA puts out a press release, and they get a lot of attention for this. It is clickbait. It gets taken by advocacy groups and turned into colorful, interesting graphics. And all of a sudden, climate change is causing more billion-dollar weather disasters. This data set is probably among the leading, most commonly accessible pieces of misinformation that's published by the U.S. government that I'm aware of in my area of interest. It badly needs to be fixed. These pictures will tell you what's wrong with simple counts of billion-dollar disasters. This is Miami Beach, about 100 years apart. 1926, a major Category 4 storm, about as strong as Andrew, but 4 times the aerial extent of Andrew, went through what was then a desolate Miami Beach. Were that to come through with today's societal conditions, our research suggests it would be a $300 billion event. That's consistent with insurance industry estimates. FEMA has a national risk index. They do a pretty good job. They estimate that in a normal year, quote unquote, average year of disasters in the United States, we should expect over $140 billion. And that number goes up every year. Of course it does. We have more people, more property, more wealth. Those are all generally viewed to be good things. So of course, billion-dollar disasters are increasing. So here's the answer to that question that was posed in the chat. U.S. weather and climate disasters as a proportion of GDP. It's not updated because Sheldis is a proprietary data set, and they only release their annual numbers a few years after. But overall, and we see this in many places around the world and at the global level as well, there's no upward trend. In fact, at the global level, it's been fairly sharply downward, particularly in poor countries. This is good news. Disasters are not getting worse as a proportion of GDP. And that squares with the fact that we don't see indicators of changes in most types of extreme events. NOAA was once on sides on this issue. This is a paper that the Smith and Katz here is responsible for collating the billion-dollar disasters. Rick Katz is an excellent statistician. He had the office next to me at NCAR a million years ago. They concluded in 2013, it is difficult to attribute any part of the trends and losses to climate variations or change, especially in the case of billion-dollar disasters. NOAA links to this from their websites that have press releases saying that the billion-dollar disasters are caused by climate change. All right, so I have some information. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. The IPCC has a framework of what's called detection and attribution. Detection refers to identifying changes in the climate that are above natural variability. So it's a statistical question. I mean, this is how we know that the Earth is warming, is that the warming that's been observed is greater than the historical natural variability. The second part is attribution. And the answer to the question, no, I have not been consulted in the Eighth Circuit case. Attribution refers to once you've detected a change, then you ask the question, then you ask the question, why has it occurred? And if it can be linked to human causes, which includes greenhouse gas emissions, the master muter might have to jump in here. So let me summarize what the IPCC says with respect to different phenomena, with respect to detection and attribution. And a lot of people are surprised when they see this summary.
I noticed that
All right. Thank you. All right. So this has, and if you want to look this up, this is a table that's not from the IPCC. I summarized it. I wish the IPCC would have summarized it. in this simple way. But you can go to Chapter 11 of Working Group 1, 6 assessment report and confirm that these are all correct. So heat waves, there are more heat waves, and that has been attributed to greenhouse gas emissions. Heavy precipitation. In some places, yes, that's been detected and attributed. Heavy precipitation, the IPCC goes to some lengths to explain, is not the same as flooding. Ecological and agricultural drought, think of that as soil moisture deficits, also, and that's related to temperature, of course, detected and attributed, and what's called fire weather, hot and dry. These have in common a relationship to temperature, and except for heavy precipitation, but you'll notice what has not been detected and attributed: flooding, meteorological drought, hydrological drought, tropical cyclones, winter storms, thunderstorms, tornadoes, hail, lightning, and extreme winds. So it is not appropriate to claim that we have detected a change in these events and that any such hypothesized change is due to increasing greenhouse gases. That's not me saying that, that's the IPCC. I have all of the relevant screenshotted information from the IPCC. I am not going to submit you to that. If you want it, it's all here. And again, it's the language of the IPCC. And to their credit, the IPCC has been very consistent and accurate for its 30+ years on extreme events. They mess up sometimes. Yes, they're not perfect and it's not a Bible, but on extreme events, Working Group 1 has really stuck to what the science can and can't say. Here's an example where they screwed up. In Chapter 11 of the Working Group 1 report, they refer to an increasing trend in normalized U.S. hurricane damage. Normalization is the technique that I just explained to you, where we adjust historical damages like what you saw on the beach in Miami for more people, more property, more wealth. And they cite this paper, Grinstead et al. 2019. So, you know, being the self-centered academic I am, I was very happy to see that the methodology we came up with was referenced by the IPCC. But I was a little bit surprised to see that they cited only one study with respect to normalization. Well, why was I surprised? In the past, the IPCC has summarized normalization studies. So this is from 2014, 10 years ago. And there weren't so many studies back then. They have different references, 9 of them. So I thought in advance of the 6th assessment report, I would help the IPCC do their work. I would assess this literature as they did in the past and put it out there for them on a silver platter. And so here is a summary of all of the normalization studies that have been published since we did the first one in 1998. The 2 columns here are from my paper, and then since my paper was published, there are these additional ones that I have down on the lower right. All in all, there's 70+ such studies. And you can see I list them here by detection claimed to be achieved in the study, attribution claimed to be achieved. Now, what's interesting is the IPCC cited this one study, Grinstead et al. It's the only one of all of these studies that claims attribution is to be achieved. There's a story behind this paper. They found a data set on the internet, and they took that data set from an insurance company and used it in their research. Turns out the data set is a bastardized version of our research that was updated through 2005, and then they stapled on the end another completely unrelated data set. And surprise, surprise, they saw a sharp increase after 2005. I'm in the process of requesting to PNAS that this paper be retracted so that others don't make the same mistake, and that is ongoing. But even so, the fact that the IPCC cited one study out of a family of more than 50 at the time, with the other 50+ coming to opposite conclusions, that was not a bright moment for the IPCC. So here's, just to belabor the point, on the left here is the Grinstead study that they highlighted. Everyone knows that it's a bad study. 25 citations. Our study, which there's others out there, but ours has a few more citations, completely ignored by the IPCC. All right, so in summary, overall, the IPCC did an excellent job, but these are the sort of conclusions that are deep in the bowels of the IPCC, but you won't find in public discussion. Go to Working Group 1, Chapter 12. They have this very useful figure, which I'd encourage you to spend some time with, more than I have here. But they're asking about the signal of climate change emerging from the context of natural variability for all of these different phenomena. And they have three periods. One is to date, so in the historical period. The second is emerging by 2050 under the most extreme scenario, RCP 8.5. That's a whole nother story. And then by 2100 under that most extreme scenario. And perhaps one of the most surprising things is that for the vast majority of extreme events, the IPCC, as indicated by these empty white entries in this table, does not believe that we've seen the signal with respect to river flood, heavy precipitation, drought, fire weather, tropical cyclones, and they don't expect it to emerge. There are some mean air temperature, extreme heat, cold spells, mean precipitation by 2050, but you can go through and see this. And again, most people are surprised to learn what the IPCC actually says. I could tell you stories all day long. I was a witness in the recent trial that involved Michael Mann suing a couple of journalists. And as part of the discovery, it was revealed that Michael Mann collaborated with a journal editor at Geophysical Research Letters to tank a paper I had submitted by hand selecting known hostile reviewers. That paper wasn't published. And if I was there with you in Palo Alto, we could go out for a beer and I could tell you stories all night, but I'm not going to do that. So let me just end up and we can have a conversation. I believe that good science wins out over bad science, but it can take a really long time. And while that's taking its time, you might lose your office. People ask me, like, if you had to do it again, what would you do differently? I like where I'm at now. And so if I had to do it all over again to get to exactly where I am now, I'd do it. But I know that that path is not for everyone, particularly young academics. And my experience is real. There are some problems in science and academia, which I'd be happy to talk about. They're deep problems. If I thought I could influence my university by staying at my university, I would, but there's no chance. I mainly make a living these days through Substack, through a newsletter called The Honest Broker. It's got 23,000 subscribers in 149 countries around the world. And so this is the advertising portion of the talk. Please sign up if you haven't already, and I appreciate your support. And I'm easy to find, and I look forward to having a chat with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was great. So let's open the floor for questions now. Feel free to raise your hands. And David, would you like to ask your question? I think Eric also has a question.
Me, David?
Yeah, David Henderson.
Yeah, actually, I was applauding, but I was just about to put the question thing up. First of all, great talk. I've been following your Substack a little now. I'll follow it more. One of the things I'm wondering, and I've seen this with COVID, where I've been more involved, and one of the people who's sometimes in this group, Jay Bhattacharya, and Iran, who's here now, have been involved, is that there seems this big disconnect between all the nasty crap you get and still where you're able to publish. And that's good, right? The second part is good, but I'm wondering how that happens. Is it the people who are referees and so on go to the better angels of their nature and judge reasonably? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have adopted a strategy over my career of trying to publish a lot of good work where I could publish it. There are some venues that I think are more gate kept than others. And, you know, if your goal is to get into nature, I haven't been published. I used to be published in science a lot. I haven't been published in science in 15 or 20 years, and I haven't tried. That said, I recently got an invitation from an editor to do a review paper for a science journal. this new paper on billion-dollar disasters is part of a special issue that I was invited to submit for. It's a Nature journal. I used to get published a lot in Nature journals. So I think, again, this is one of those things where it's not for everyone, because careers advance by publishing in high impact, notable journals. But if the goal is to get good science out into the world, I find that the combination of very good journals with fair peer review, plus in my case, a big public platform is just as good as publishing in I don't need press releases on my papers. So that said, IPCC felt like it could freely ignore not just my research, but all of the research that builds on research that I and colleagues have done. So it is tough. And for me, it's better, last thing I'll say, it's better to publish and get stuff out there. And there are a lot of fair reviewers who are doing good science, who are underneath the radar screen. There are also a smaller number of highly visible people who try to gatekeep and police the scientific discourse. I don't think that's particularly unique to climate. It's just that climate is such a big, big issue with heavy political stakes.
Thank you.
Eric?
Yeah, I won't ask my question in the chat. We can talk about that later. But along the same lines, at MIT, we've had a hard time getting faculty to even admit that they've talked to us. I think the reason is they rely heavily on government grants, and it's so easy to cut somebody out of the grants even without saying you're doing it. Do you have any ideas on how scientists whose whole research career depends on having the pleasure of the government can be gotten to resist government censorship?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had millions of dollars in federal science grants over my career, almost all in the first half of my career. I was told by an NSF program officer, don't submit anymore because you're not fundable anymore. And so I changed my approach to, not building a big lab at my university and doing research that I can do. For those who are whose work necessarily involves big instruments or big research teams, that choice isn't available to them. I've long argued that we need stronger institutions of science, and that includes things like national academies, funding agencies, assessment bodies like the IPCC. These organizations are subject to capture by interests, and the same thing goes for a research program, as might go for a National Academies Committee and so on. This is not a unique problem in science. Historically, science has its politics inside science. And so, earlier in my career, the forms of capture that I worried about was, one school of thought or one set of scholars who dominate a discipline. And that certainly, is not rare. This is just another form of that sort of capture where we in the expert community need to do a better job of demanding accountability, transparency, diversity in review panels, and so on. And it's not easy, but I do think that the fact that, on an issue like climate, the fact that the politics of those who are in the community are so homogeneous that it's very hard to create that sort of diversity. The other factor is that for a better part of a decade, the climate community worked very hard to excommunicate anyone who was outside that narrow political view. And so it's been kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't have any better advice than that. I think it's easier to do when we're talking about expert advisory committees, such as under the FACA legislation, where they are visible and transparent. There's no way to get around the importance of leadership. So the editors of journals, editorial boards, if they are constructed so as to have narrow viewpoints and exclude certain points of view, whether in the funding process or the publication process, they'll probably succeed for some amount of time. It's not a super positive outcome, but I think we have to keep demanding greater leadership from those who are in the top positions in our fields.
Can I follow up on that? So are you saying it's the referee panels, it's not the bureaucrats? Because that's more a problem.
Well, it's chicken and egg there, because who comprises the referee panels? Usually it's the bureaucrats. I don't have a strong sense that most federal bureaucrats are in there trying to put their thumb on the scale and so on. Many people, if you're a rotator that goes to the National Science Foundation or NASA or somewhere like that in the climate area, one of the most important things is you're trying to make a name for your own self in the community, right? So pushing against the grain, including heterodox views on your review panels, that's not going to make people happy out in the community, especially people that are expecting to be funded. Just take a look at all of the dynamics that we've all been observing with EcoHealth Alliance and the public health research funding environment. It becomes very chummy and clubby very quickly. And I don't think climate is that different, but I think this is more of a community, kind of an emergent issue from a community that is too homogeneous than it is of somebody pulling the strings in the federal agencies.
Richard, you're muted.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the presentation. This might seem a little bit obscure, or am I frozen up?
I hear you.
Okay, for some reason I asked you the question about the SEC's ESG report.
And we
Now
lost him.
Now you're gone.
Okay, do you want to ask?
Can you hear? Can you? Yeah. So I asked you the question about the ESG for some reason. The reason I asked you is I think it's a significant issue. There's some question about the constitutionality of what the SEC did, and one of the ways they're trying to justify their mandate is that they claim these costs are real important to investors. So if you could provide data on the fact that these costs have not really increased over time, and therefore they haven't grown in importance relative to commodity risks or inflation risks, et cetera, I think it would be relevant to the pending litigation, because as you might know, there's a lawsuit against the SEC saying it exceeded its constitutional authority in mandating greenhouse gas disclosures and elevating the importance of severe weather damage in financial reporting due to climate risk.
Yeah, put somebody in touch with me. I'm happy to talk.
John Stallon.
Hi, Dr. Pielke. Thanks very much. I had no idea of the personal problems that you had encountered at the University of Colorado. I've written a couple of books about science and the problems with science and so on. And I wonder what your reaction would be to two of the conclusions I came to. One is that a serious problem in many areas of science is monopsony, the monopoly source of funding. For biomedical research, it's NIH. For a lot of other areas, it's NSF or the Defense Department and so on. So that is a problem in the uniformity of viewpoint of the reviewers. It is enforced by the structure of the whole thing. A second problem from that is that evaluating the science over a 3 to 5 year window, treating science like an engineering project, which it is not. I mean, the whole point of basic science is the possibility, particularly in experimental science, of lots of failure. And failure is simply punished by the current system. So I'd appreciate if you have any thoughts about those two issues. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are both really important. And like, as you imply, the dynamics we have are an emergent outcome from a lot of different factors. I don't think it's entirely, the federal government funding of science on these highly politicized issues that's entirely the problem. I think it's also the involvement of super wealthy people. I mean, in the climate issue, you look at Bloomberg, Steyer, and their funding. I wrote a piece not long ago on my Substack about how it was a brilliant effort. They had a coordinated effort to fund research, to get it presented at the American Geophysical Union, to get it into peer-reviewed journals. One reason the the most extreme scenario came to be viewed as business as usual, the so-called RCP 8.5, is because billionaires helped make it that way. And if you're a player in the research community, getting funding from billionaires is a good thing. So I think there is a diversity of funding, but there is a monopsony of outlook, perhaps, among those doing the funding. Early on, I decided I was not going to ever, work for foundation funding or philanthropic support, because when I would meet with those people, this is when I ran a Science Policy Institute, they would say, we're nervous about funding you because we don't know what the answers are going to be to your research. And my response would be, well, that's why we're doing the research. We don't know the answers. If we knew the answers, you wouldn't have to fund us. And so they were always focused much more on advocacy and promoting, a certain technology or whatever. So science flourishes when there are open avenues for dissent, debate, contestation, and, as you say, failure. And in our public discourse, and again, most of science works really, really, really well. It's only these ones that are in the deep end of the political sea where I think these issues come up. There, we need to have much stronger institutions to recognize and accommodate politics. You're not going to insulate science from politics, but we can accommodate the fact that science operates in a very political context.
Eric.
Well, I think you've been stuck in a field that's so bad you don't realize how bad it is in other fields. Because the MIT thing I was talking about is sort of, my impression is that you think a mechanical engineer wouldn't have to fear losing his grants if he supported Israel in public or opposed DEI or supported Roger Pielke, because he'll get past peer review by other mechanical engineers. But my perception is they don't think that. They're scared anyway. They think if they come out against DEI, they will not be able to run their gears against each other, that the money will all disappear. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? I'm not a scientist. My economists are lucky too, because my kind of economics, we don't need money either.
Yeah, I mean, there's this dynamic, and I see it with my colleagues, my younger colleagues coming up, is everyone says, well, until you get tenure, keep your head down. Keep your head down. Don't rock the boat. Don't do anything that'll jeopardize, don't get crossways with an administrator or your colleagues. And after 7 years, that training has worked well. People keep their heads down. And then they get tenure. And then on the other side, they're like, well, everything's been working so great so far. I'm not going to all of a sudden start telling people what I really think. So we do have these institutional incentives that I do think put a lot of pressure on people. But all of the cases you cite, whether it's Israel or DEI or climate change or COVID, these are the most politicized of the political across the board. I know, funding for, large aperture telescopes has its own politics also. But I do think it's very different sort of thing than the cases that you cite. I also think that the United States has 3,600 universities, something like that. And that these issues are primarily issues in, at most a few hundred, probably less than that, which we consider to be flagship or elite universities, where the bulk of the research funding goes and most of the public intellectuals happen to sit. I'm of the view that universities in overall and overwhelmingly work really good in the United States. It's just at this intersection of science policy and politics where things kind of get kludged up.
I have a question, Roger. So I'm not a climate scientist, but I have the impression that maybe 10, 15 years ago, climate policy was really framed by economists, right? As sort of a cost-benefit problem where we had to internalize externalities and use cap and trade or taxes. My sense is that more and more economists have given up on framing this debate. And so I have some friends who are actually involved in these issues. And so that even the economists have given up on sort of the cost and benefit analysis when it comes to solving these issues. Do you have the same impression, and do you know why this is happening?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, over the many years of the climate movement, let's say, the IPCC names its working groups 1, 2, and 3 in that order for a reason, with number 1 being the physical sciences, number 2 being impacts, and number 3 being economics. In the real structure of things, economics starts everything through climate scenarios, so really should be working group 1. We do have this deference of policymakers and in the media to physical sciences. And so I do think it's been fairly consistent that policy advice on climate has long been the domain of people who don't have policy training or expertise. Economists have had a profound role. The 2-degree target itself comes from an aside from Bill Nordhaus in the 1977 white paper. I think the failure of cap and trade in the United States showed that carbon pricing was probably not going to be in the cards politically, and so it's difficult to sustain interest in a movement where the primary tool advocated by economists has been politically rejected. I and colleagues have long recommended a very low carbon price, not to change people's behavior, but to raise funds for transforming, innovating the energy system. That hasn't gone anywhere either. The other issue is, and I've seen this in my career, is climate science used to be dominated by climate nerds. And I say that lovingly because my dad is a climate nerd. But people who are just fascinated with the Earth system and the atmosphere and how it works, they weren't global campaigners. They weren't trying to save the planet. And over time, there has been a tendency for more and more people to come into the climate space. I see this with students as advocates first and scientists second. And I think that has led to, maybe not so much economists dropping out, but being pushed to the side. There's a very strong anti-economics focus among many people. There's a recent paper that was out that looked at the views of scientists who participate in the IPCC, and some 40% of them are degrowthers. So it's the character of climate science has itself changed, even as the central scientific messages have remained constant. But I think that's why we get a lot of the extreme messaging that we do. Just yesterday, there was a piece out in The Guardian where Damien Carrington at The Guardian surveyed 380 IPCC participants. And the quotes that were there are some of the most doomist perspectives out there. People, it's almost Paul Ehrlich-like, billions of people are going to die in the near future. And so I think that's altered the character of the climate science community.
Thank you. Bill, and then Jonathan, and then Ken.
Thank you. And I'd like to just reflect on comments that both Eric and Ivan made, and actually that Roger just made. So bear with me for a moment. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Bill Frezza, one of the founders and directors at the MIT Free Speech Alliance. First, I've spent the last 6 months trying to foment the formation of a faculty group at MIT similar to the one Steve Pinker put together at Harvard on academic freedom, and it's been a complete bust. I just cannot get these guys to raise their heads. And I'm talking about senior people, not junior faculty. They will not stick their necks out. And I've almost given up hope trying to insert some courage into the MIT community and beginning to think that only guerrilla warfare is going to work. And of course, I got a lot of stuff going on in that area. One of the things you should note is that they brag that over 20% of MIT's faculty is now on the climate change gravy train. They have all figured out how to, whatever research they're doing, whether they're doing robots or AI or healthcare, it doesn't matter. They figured out how to twist their proposals to make it climate change related, and the money's pouring in. So you just can't stop money flows like that. The second thing is that we are preparing our fall great debate. You may be aware that once a semester we run debates on controversial issues, and this one's going to be on climate. And I'd like to get your reaction to the draft resolution that we're going to be debating, because I think it needs some tuning yet. And the premise here is that we're accepting climate science without question. Climate science is what it is. This is strictly on climate policy. And the idea is to say, okay, take your models as a given, take your policies, plug your policies into your models, and tell me whether the results are worth it. That's the structure. So the resolution is resolved. The total cost of net zero decarbonization required to achieve the Paris Paris Climate Accord goals is well worth the projected benefits delivered by the predicted reduction in global temperatures. So we're trying to constrain this so that people could use their own models to answer their own questions. Is it worth it? What do you think of that? Do you think we can get them to engage in that kind of a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, and let me just say first, I'm happy to engage with you, apart from this forum as well on this. The only thing that I see that's an issue with that framing is that policy is the free variable. And so what I would say is, yeah, of course it's worth it, because we would only adopt policies that by definition that are worth it. We implement stupid policies from time to time, but like science, policy is self-correcting, even if it's frustrating and you might lose your office in the meantime. But people are not going to stand for higher priced energy forcibly imposed. I mean, the yellow vest protests in France occurred over something like 2 euro cents. So I'm squarely in the camp that if we look out to 2050, climate policy only succeeds if we design policies that go with the wind of public opinion and economics, not against those. So anyway, let's talk about that offline, and I'd be happy to discuss. I guess, and the other thing is, anybody who says they know the cost of anything to 2050, I got a Substack to sell you.
Jonathan.
Not sure if can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
There's the elephant in the room, and I bring this up every time in the seminar when it comes up, which is this underlying theme that what I call in the public good. If the science is deemed not in the public good, it is okay to ignore the science or to manipulate the science. We saw it in COVID. I think we see it here, and we see it in other aspects. I think that's the underlying issue.
Yeah, I mean, if I understand you correctly, I mean, this is what I and others call noble cause corruption. And there's a lot of noble cause corruption that I've seen. I can go back. Here's another story. In 2002, I was invited to brief the Secretary of Treasury and a number of senators on climate change. And I got contacted by a very prominent climate scientist who says, you do good research, but it really shows that societal factors are driving disaster losses, not climate change. And you might want to think about presenting that differently when you have an audience with such important people. The extreme events are probably a poster child for noble cause corruption, because all of this stuff is in the IPCC, and it's routinely ignored by people very smart people who are in the media and in science who should know better. And I haven't figured it out. Just calling this stuff out.
But why are we not calling it out for what it is? It's all the same thing in COVID. Why do people? We always hear people say, well, people aren't looking at the science, and the science is not correctly reported. Why aren't we saying no? It's intentional.
I'm one that has actually called that out, but I can also tell you I spent 2 years in my department at the University of Colorado with stuff being stored in my office, and every single one of my peers knew it that was in my department, and not a single one of them complained about it. One colleague said, I'd like to help, but I don't want them to come after me too. So there is some degree of groupthink, but also institutional enforcement of these norms. Another story, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist quoted me in the LA Times, and she was savaged by others in the media, and they called for her to be fired because she quoted me. Brett Stevens just gave a talk at Stanford. I was just there last month. He quoted me in the New York Times, and he said it took an act of courage for him to quote me. So in that context, I don't, it's a problem, but I fully understand why people behave the way they do.
Ken, and then John Cochran.
Yes, I disagree with an earlier comment that economists have generally not been a major force within the climate policy world. I mean, not the economists that are sort of in major economics departments, I remember I gave a part of a presentation to a foundation in 2008. And most of the people were physical scientists. There was one economist on the panel. And one of the guys I was told who had a Nobel Prize in chemistry on the panel said, "What do we need economics for? We know what needs to be done." And so this is 2008, and I think that really summarized their attitude then and now. Also, if you look at the economic modeling behind these IPCC scenarios, BAU, 8.5, whatever, they don't come from any serious economic model of, that the MIT has a group has a model which basically is like the dynamic models that I studied in the 70s. Not perfect foresight. They call them recursive, but it's not what we mean by recursive now. So these economic models have no uncertainty in them, as if everybody knows the future perfectly. And so so the thing is that this is adding in serious economic analysis is not something that the IPCC people in control of it want. Now, as far as the cost benefit stuff, I actually listened to a couple of weeks ago a benefit cost society session on discounting the future. Now, of course, we all know that's the way you get whatever number you want. High discount means low social cost of carbon. Low means big, and so but discounting is a serious thing, and it's done all the time by using financial economics concepts. But this one finance professor asserted that, oh, it's way too hard to try to model. We'll never figure it out. And my response is, well, people are in their arguments are making assumptions about discounting. So let's see what the implications are of those assumptions. But that kind of approach is also not desired. I mean, the whole policy the whole conversation is driven by the physical scientists who don't have a high opinion of economists. I know from personal conversations. And then when economists try to get involved, they aren't welcomed. And then a lot of economists just say, well, we really can't answer those questions. So
yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, what people don't know in the wider community is that the puppet masters behind climate policy are the integrated assessment modelers. I'm pretty sure most serious economists would not want to claim them, but they will represent themselves as economists at times. But these energy system modelers really constrain what is in policy view, what is outside of policy view. And there's only a few groups around the world. And this is, for a long time, has been much more about disciplinary capture, I think, than political capture, although those issues have kind of merged. But it is shocking the degree to which our discussions of climate policy originate in a handful of integrated assessment models around the world. That's starting to open up, but it might be a few IPCC cycles after I'm long gone before it's really opened up.
John.
I have an observation, two observations, and the second one is more like a question. On the economics versus weather, this is a great presentation on the science, but it is strange that we even fight about the science, given that the economic uncertainties are just orders of magnitude larger. If you've looked at either the integrated assessment models that you have, what is the economic effect of climate change? The old joke that we have a sense of humor because we use decimal points is actually, they use the first significant digit. The information that goes into that is just junk, largely ignoring that everybody's moving from New York to Texas. So, how can heat matter? But the most important one is that what policy follows. Let us say RCP 8.5 is right. What should we do about it? Does that mean we should all buy electric cars made in the U.S. with a U.S. union labor and so on and so forth? That is the uncertainties around that are orders of magnitude larger. But the observation with the question that I want to ask you, other than just raising the flag for economists, well, sorry, my fellow economists have been terrible at this, raising the flag for we ought to ask serious economic questions, not the ones they're asking. You have a horrible story of the political persecution of people who think out of the mainstream on climate. It didn't used to be that way. Several other questioners mentioned it. It started in the 1990s as sort of a technocratic issue, like chlorofluorocarbons was bipartisan. Let's do something about this. You know, the way the Clean Air Act was bipartisan. Then I wonder if you have insights. How did this turn so crazy? Some people say Al Gore turned it into a partisan issue. And, Republicans must be evil if they don't. But it became a good versus evil thing around 2000s. Not quite sure how. You suffered through, a lot of the extreme partisanship. It got then it merged into the degrowthers, who seem to have got what they wanted in Europe. And now we're kind of looking, ooh, we killed growth. And gee, maybe that isn't doing so good. But then with the climate justice, climate has to be saved by ending capitalism and embracing indigenous ways of knowing and marginalized communities. I mean, unless you do the climate of marginalized communities, there's no point of doing climate. And a new strain, which I think you're running into, the eco-authoritarians who are, upfront about what they're saying. They took seriously, the world's going to end in 10 years, so we can't let democracy do this. We got to take over. You ran into that, the kind of censorship even being done by the Obama administration and the new administration. The censorship implied in a single point, politicized point for all grant funding. That's authoritarian. That's sort of end of democracy stuff. So how did this happen? And where will it go? I think there's hope that there's enough democracy left. The average voter is saying, you've got to be kidding, and throw all the junk out. But on the other hand, the reins of power deep in the administrative state are pretty deep. And it's kind of troubling where it's going. So how did it happen? Where's it going?
Yeah, what's a great question. I'm sure there will eventually be many PhDs written on this moment, the climate moment. From where I sit, I think there's a long history here that goes back to the millenarian, Malthusian, neo-Malthusian movements. You can go back to the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And just as, the global population scare was winding down in intensity, there's climate change that shows up that incorporated many of the same factors and features. I do think that Al Gore's part of the story, but I don't think it's the main part of the story. Maybe with respect to extreme events and the hurricane coming the wrong way out of the smokestack. I do think that there has been some degree of institutional capture by people and, anti-capitalist degrowth, anti-human. Population is the origins of the problem. Consumption's the origins of the problem. And the failure is not that these people exist or have tried to assert control over important institutions. It's that while this happened, scientific leadership has been absent. Where has it gone? The fact that John Holdren, who I've met, he came to Colorado, gave a nice speech at our center. The fact that John Holdren was a science advisor for President Obama, after his history of, advocating population policies and, really being an early degrowther, is remarkable to me. And we have created a system where those sorts of views are rewarded. And whether people believe them or not, you have prominent editors at places like Nature or Science, who are willing to espouse those views. I'll name some names. Michael Mann and Naomi Oreskes have, landed in Ivy League faculty positions, basically by espousing Malthusian comments. It's a very popular view. Now, I know hundreds, maybe thousands of people who do climate work, and based on my experiences, this is not a majority view, and not everyone's a campaigner. And there's a lot of people who are in it because they're in the field. But everyone knows who's in charge, who wields power. Who doesn't wield power? And so it's taken a long time, decades, but this is a situation that we allowed to happen. So I don't see it unwinding anytime soon. I do think energy reality and energy economic realities have a tendency to focus at least policymakers' minds. So, I'm very optimistic that Europe will come to its senses. Japan has already come to its senses. China has never lost its senses. And so, the African continent is going to develop across the board is not going to have time for, saying, oh, let's have some solar panels on roofs. They need industrial economies and they're going to get them. And so I do think the energy realities are going to push the kind of the more fringy millenarian sect to the side.
Thank you very much, Roger. This was great. I hope next time we'll have you in person here at Stanford. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And next week we'll have, not next week, actually, on the 23rd, we'll have Cass Sunstein to talk about liberalism.
Thanks, Roger.